I arrived at the Salem orphanage when I was about 8 years old, just after my parents died in a car accident. The building was old. Its stone walls seemed to sum up an eternal sadness. The atmosphere in the orphanage was always gloomy, with an air of hopelessness that clung to everyone who lived there. However, it didn't take me long to adjust to the strict routine. Waking up early, making the beds, eating breakfast in silence, and attending classes. The dormitory I shared with 6 other children was cold and dark, with narrow beds lined up against the walls. Often at night, I would hear whispers and footsteps outside the room. I always assumed it was the headmistress or one of the caretakers. However, there was something else about those walls, something I felt every time I looked at them in the dim light. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I noticed some marks on the wall next to my bed. They were small scratches, seemingly at random. The next day, during recess, I commented on the marks to one of my classmates. To my surprise, he had also noticed similar marks on his side of the dormitory. We looked at each other with concern but decided not to tell the caretakers anything. The weeks went by, and the marks began to multiply. Sometimes new marks would appear overnight, deeper and more numerous. One night, I couldn't help but get up and examine the walls more closely. The marks, at first jumbled, began to form a more defined pattern. To my horror, I realized that they seemed to converge into a pentagram shape. I tried not to think about it, but the marks continued to torment my mind. Who or what made them? One night, while the others were sleeping, I woke up to a soft scratching noise. I got out of bed, and by the light of my flashlight, I saw that the marks seemed to glow with a faint reddish glow. My heart was pounding as I watched the lines continue to form on their own, moving as if they had a life of their own. I woke my parents up and showed them what I had discovered. At first, they thought I was joking, but when they saw the marks for themselves, the fear in their eyes mirrored mine. We decided to investigate further and began to follow the marks during the day, hoping to find some clue as to its origin. Our first discovery was in the basement, a dark, dusty place we rarely visited. Among old boxes and broken furniture, we found more marks, deeper and with additional symbols around the pentagram. There were spent candles and ashes on the floor and a pungent smell we couldn't identify. The following nights were torture. The noises became louder and more frequent, and the marks continued to appear. A few days later, one of the children disappeared. It was not unusual for someone to be adopted or moved, but this time no one gave any explanations. He simply disappeared, and the caretakers acted as if he had never existed. Fear took hold of us. We knew something terrible was happening, but we were terrified to speak. As the marks became more complex, I decided we had to seek help outside the orphanage. The problem was we had no one to turn to. The few adults we knew seemed to be under the control of the director, a stern and reserved woman who showed no interest in us or our problems. A few days later, while checking the marks in the basement, we found an old book hidden behind some boxes. It was covered in dust and mold and looked very old. We opened it carefully and saw that it was full of drawings and symbols similar to those that appeared on the walls. The text was written in a language we did not understand, but the images were clear: pentagrams, rituals, and sacrifices. Fear turned to panic. We understood that something dark and evil was happening in the orphanage. The marks on the walls were not simple scratches but part of an ancient and dangerous ritual. We decided that we had to stop it, but we did not know how. That night, while everyone was sleeping, I sneaked up to the director's office. I knew I would find answers there. The pool was dark and cold. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting disturbing shadows on the walls. I searched the drawers and the desk but found nothing. Then, I noticed a small door behind a closet. I opened it and discovered a staircase that went down to a hidden room. The room was small and lit by candles. In the center, there was an altar with strange symbols and objects I didn't recognize. On the walls, there were more pentagrams and macabre drawings. But what terrified me the most was seeing the director standing next to the altar, muttering words in an ancient language. It was surrounded by photographs of missing children, each with a pentagram-shaped mark on their face. I tried to back away, but the director saw me. Her eyes shone with an indescribable evil. "You have seen too much," she said in a cold tone. I felt a cold hand grab my arm and realized that one of the caretakers was behind me. I tried to fight, but they dragged me towards the altar. The director began to recite a spell, and the marks on the walls began to glow brightly. I felt a dark and evil energy come back to me, and I knew my life was in danger. Just when I thought that everything was lost, I heard a loud bang. The door of the hidden room swung open, and several police officers entered, followed by a priest. The police arrested the director and the caretakers, and the priest began to recite prayers, purifying the room. They released me, and I was taken to a safe place. The next few days were confusing and filled with interrogations. I found out that the priest had been contacted by one of my classmates who had managed to escape and ask for help. The orphanage was closed down, and the children were relocated. The director and the caretakers were arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping and murder. The priest explained that the marks on the walls were part of an ancient ritual to summon a demon, and that the director had been performing it for years to prolong her life and gain power. Although we were safe, the experience left me marked forever. I will never forget the nights of terror at the orphanage and the marks on the walls that led us to discover the truth. Sometimes, in my nightmares, I still see the pentagrams and hear the dark whispers. But the worst of all is knowing that somewhere, other children could be facing the same horror. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. My life at Shady Pines Orphanage was a constant mix of monotony and fear. The daily routine was full of repetitive tasks, and although the caretakers tried to be kind, there was a palpable feeling of unease that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. The orphanage itself was an old building with dark hallways and cold rooms. It seemed as if time had stopped there, trapping memories of bygone eras and the shadows of those who once lived within its walls. It was in the wing of the orphanage intended for sick children where things began to become more disturbing. I was in fragile health and would often find myself in the infirmary, surrounded by other children who also suffered from various ailments. It was there that I first heard the stories about the nurse. It was said that a deceased nurse still haunted the orphanage, caring for the sick children during the night. At first, I thought they were just stories to scare the little ones, but soon I realized there was something more behind those tales. The caretakers would speak in whispers when they thought no one was listening, mentioning the ghost nurse with fear in their voices. One night, when I was in the infirmary room recovering from a high fever, I felt a presence in the room. I was alone, or at least I believed I was, but a figure moved in the shadows. I felt a cold hand on my forehead, a soft and comforting caress that contrasted with the fear that invaded me. I opened my eyes and saw a middle-aged woman dressed in an old nurse's uniform. Her face was kind, but her eyes reflected a deep sadness. "Rest," she whispered. Her voice was like a distant echo, and before I could react, she vanished into the air. The next day, I told the other children what I had seen. Some believed me. Others told me it was just a high fever that had made me imagine things. But the figure of the nurse continued to appear, always at night, always when a child needed help. The symptoms seemed to ease after her visits, as if her presence had a healing effect. However, with each appearance, I also felt that something darker was happening. I decided to investigate more about the history of the orphanage and the mysterious nurse. I found an old diary hidden in one of the dusty shelves of the orphanage library. The diary belonged to a nurse who had worked there decades ago. As I read through her entries, a disturbing story began to emerge. The nurse, whose name was never mentioned in the journal, had discovered that the orphanage was not what it seemed. The children were not only sick from natural causes, some had been slowly poisoned. The nurse had grown suspicious of the caretakers and the headmistress of the orphanage and had begun documenting her findings in her journal. One entry in particular made me shudder. The nurse had discovered a secret room in the basement of the orphanage where the headmistress performed dark rituals. The children who disappeared from the orphanage were not transferred to other homes, as the others had been told. They were sacrificed in these rituals. The nurse had decided to confront the headmistress, but that was her last entry. I realized then that the nurse had been murdered for uncovering the dark secrets of the orphanage. Her spirit had been trapped there, caring for the children in an attempt to protect them from the same headmistress who had killed her. I felt a mixture of fear and compassion for that lost soul, and I decided that I must do something to help find peace and expose the truth. I gathered some of the bravest children and showed them the diary. Together, we planned a way to discover the secret room in the basement. We waited until night when the caretakers and the director were asleep, and we crept through the dark corridors towards the basement. The air grew colder as I descended, and an eerie silence enveloped us. We found the door hidden behind an old bookcase. It was a heavy and rusty door, but we managed to open it with effort. What we saw on the other side took our breath away. The room was filled with strange symbols and unlit candles. In the center, a sacrificial table stained with dried blood. We stood still, terrified by the magnitude of what we had discovered. Suddenly, the figure of the nurse appeared before us, her sad but determined face. She pointed towards a corner of the room, where we found a pile of small bones, the remains of the children who had been sacrificed. Her spirit seemed more desperate than ever, as if she knew that time was running out. Exhausted, we decided to take the evidence to the police. It was our only hope of ending the horrors of the orphanage. We left the room and ran towards the basement exit, but the director and the caretakers were waiting for us. They had followed us, and their faces reflected a mixture of fury and fear. They dragged us back to the basement, and the director began to scream, accusing us of trying to destroy her sacred work. We realized that we were in imminent danger. The figure of the nurse appeared once again, standing between us and the director. Her presence seemed to weaken the director, who backed away, screaming at us. We took advantage of the distraction and ran, managing to escape from the orphanage. We went straight to the police station and showed them the diary and the evidence we had found. At first, the officers were skeptical but finally agreed to investigate. They returned to the orphanage with us, and what they found confirmed our stories. The director and the caretakers were arrested, and the orphanage was permanently closed. The children were transferred to other facilities, and the building was left empty and deserted. We never saw the spirit of the nurse again, but I will always remember her face and her determination to protect us. Her sacrifice and her fight for justice were not in vain. Although the horrors of the orphanage left deep scars on our souls, we knew that we had helped to free a brave spirit and stop an unspeakable evil. The orphanage was bulldozed shortly after, and in its place a park was built. Sometimes when I drive by, I stop and listen, hoping to hear the soft voice of the nurse who cared for us from beyond. Her story lives on in our memories, and her bravery reminds us that even in the darkest places, there is light and hope. The night in Hillcrest is a place where the wind always seems to whisper ancient secrets, a perpetual echo of forgotten and painful stories. For years, I had heard about the abandoned orphanage on top of the hill, a place that the locals avoided with a mixture of fear and respect. It was said that the children who once lived there had suffered terribly, and their spirits were not at peace. I decided, for some reason that now seems utterly stupid, that I wanted to see the place for myself. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe a morbid need to face my own fears. What I found was so much more than I could have ever imagined. I arrived at the village at dusk when the last rays of sunlight had turned the surrounding mountains orange. The locals, upon hearing of my intention to visit the orphanage, tried to dissuade me. Their warnings were vehement and sincere, but my mind was made up. With a flashlight, a backpack with basic supplies, and my camera, I began my climb up the winding road that led to the orphanage. As I approached, the wind seemed to take on a life of its own, howling and screeching as if trying to push me back. The orphanage loomed before me, a dark, twisted structure against the twilight sky. The building was in ruins, with broken windows that looked like empty eyes watching anyone who dared approach. The front door hung on its hinges, slowly opening and closing in the wind like a mouth that whispered warnings. Crossing the threshold was like entering another dimension. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the air was heavy with an oppressive feeling of sadness and pain. I walked through the hall, shining my flashlight on the walls covered in graffiti and dust. The smell of humidity and decay was almost unbearable, but I continued forward. The first floor was made up of a series of small rooms, probably offices and bedrooms. In each one, there was broken furniture, rotten mattresses, and old toys scattered on the floor. I stopped in a room that still had a crib in a corner. As I approached, I felt a chill run down my spine. The crib was empty, but the feeling that someone was watching me was palpable. The next level of the orphanage, I climbed up a rickety staircase, housed the dining room and the kitchen. The long, sturdy dining room table was covered in a thick layer of dust, but still held the remains of what was once a meal. Broken plates and rusty cutlery lay scattered. It was then that I heard the first sound, a barely audible whisper as if someone was speaking in a low voice. I looked all around me, but there was no one. I decided to move on, although fear was beginning to settle in my chest. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was even denser. The pots and pans were rusty, and the sink was full of dirty dishes as if someone had suddenly abandoned the place. When examining one of the cupboards, I heard a noise behind me. As I turned, I saw a shadow move quickly out of the corner of my eye. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I tried to stay calm. I couldn't allow fear to control me. I continued my exploration towards the third floor, which, according to my investigations, housed the children's rooms. The atmosphere here was almost suffocating. The walls were covered with children's drawings, most of them strangely disturbing. Shadowy figures, sad faces, and scenes from what seemed to be nightmares. It was here that I began to hear the first clear sounds of laughter and crying. The mix was disconcerting, creating a macabre symphony that echoed in the empty hallways. I entered one of the rooms. The small beds lined up along the walls were in an advanced state of deterioration. But what caught my attention the most was a small rag doll sitting on one of the beds. It looked out of place, almost new in contrast to the decaying surroundings. As I approached to examine it, a loud knock resounded on the door behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. However, the door was now closed. Although I was sure I had left it open, panic began to take hold of me. I tried to open the door, but it was firmly locked. It was then that the laughter intensified, filling the room, followed by whispers and moans. I felt a rose on my shoulder as if an invisible hand was trying to catch my attention. I stepped back, my mind struggling to find a rational explanation, but the fear was too overwhelming. Finally, with an almost superhuman effort, I managed to open the door and run out into the hallway. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Almost as I moved towards the stairs, I saw more shadows moving around me, and the laughter mixed with desperate screams. I descended the steps 2 by 2, feeling that something or someone was following me closely. I reached the main hall, and the exit door was there, hanging from its hinges like the mouth of a predator waiting for its prey. I ran towards it, feeling an invisible force pulling on my backpack as if it were holding me back. I finally managed to get out and stumbled, falling to the ground outside the building. The cold night wind hit me, and the oppression I had felt inside the orphanage eased slightly. I quickly got up and began to walk away from the building without looking back. As I approached the town, the laughter and crying faded, but the feeling of being watched remained. When I got to my car, I realized that I had left my flashlight and camera behind, but I had no intention of going back to look for them. The following days were a mix of insomnia and nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows and heard the laughter. I went to the doctor, who prescribed me sedatives, but even these could not calm my mind. I decided to investigate more about the orphanage, and what I found only served to increase my terror. I discovered old records that detailed the abuse and neglect that children had suffered. Cruel punishments, isolation, and deprivation were common. Deaths, many of them unexplained, had been covered up by the authorities of the time. The bodies of the children were buried in the orphanage cemetery without ceremony or respect. Rumors about the place became clearer to me. It was not just an abandoned orphanage. It was a place of suffering where the souls of the children still cried out for justice. The phenomena I had experienced were their desperate attempts to communicate, to let the world know the pain they had endured. I decided to share my experience with others in the hope that someone might help calm the spirits of those children. However, every time I tried to tell my story, the shadows seemed to draw closer, and laughter echoed in my head. The feeling of being watched never left me, a constant reminder of my encounter with the unexplainable. My mental and physical health began to deteriorate. Doctors could not find a cause for my symptoms, and treatments offered no relief. My friends and family began to worry, but they couldn't understand the magnitude of what I had experienced. The orphanage of Hillcrest had left an indelible mark on my soul, a scar that would not heal easily. Finally, I understood that my only option was to return to the orphanage, face the place again, and try to make peace with the spirits that lived there. I prepared my equipment, including a new camera and several flashlights, and headed back to Hillcrest. This time, I was not alone. I had contacted a group of paranormal investigators who agreed to accompany me, attracted by the story and eager to document any activity. Upon arriving at the orphanage, the wind whispered its usual warning, but this time, I did not let myself be intimidated. We entered the building, and the familiar oppression returned immediately. However, with the company of the investigators, I felt safer. While exploring, one of them, a medium, claimed to feel the presence of several spirits, all of them children with faces that reflected fear and sadness. The medium, with closed eyes and an expression of pain, began to speak in a gentle tone, trying to communicate with the restless souls. He expressed words of consolation, asking forgiveness for the sufferings they had endured and assuring them that their stories would not be forgotten. The atmosphere in the orphanage became even more intense. The laughter and cries mixed together, echoing in every corner of the building. I felt a mixture of fear and compassion, but I remained firm, determined to help the spirits find the peace they so needed. While the medium continued his communication, one of the researchers found a door that seemed to have been recently unearthed. It was covered in scratches, as if someone had desperately tried to escape. We decided to open the door, and in doing so, we discovered a staircase that led to a basement. The darkness inside was total, and a feeling of deep unease enveloped us. We descended cautiously, lighting the way with our flashlights. When we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a large room that had clearly been used for confinement and punishment. The walls were covered with drawings made by children. The room had several small cells, barely big enough to hold a child. I felt a surge of rage and sadness as I saw the conditions these children had been kept in. It was apparent that this was the epicenter of suffering, the place where souls had been trapped. The medium knelt on the floor, whispering words in an ancient language none of us recognized. He seemed to be performing some sort of ritual, and as he did so, the atmosphere began to change. The laughter and crying intensified, filling the room with an almost unbearable din. I felt something invisible brush against my skin, as if small hands were trying to get my attention. Suddenly, one of the researchers shouted, pointing towards one of the cells. Inside, a dark figure moved slowly, almost as if it were emerging from the shadows. It was a child, his face pale, and empty eyes staring at us with a mix of curiosity and sadness. The medium, still whispering, extended his hand towards the figure, who slowly began to fade into the air, as if he was finally finding rest. One by one, more figures appeared, each one fading away after a brief moment of recognition. It was a heartbreaking sight, but also hopeful to see that the spirits of the children were finally finding the peace they so deserved. The process lasted several hours, and when the last of the spirits faded away, the atmosphere in the basement changed drastically. The oppression and cold dissipated, leaving a feeling of calm and relief. We left the basement feeling like we had accomplished an important mission. The orphanage, although still a desolate and ruined place, no longer felt so threatening. We knew that we had helped free the trapped souls, and with that, perhaps the building could one day find a new purpose. We returned to the village where the locals greeted us with a mix of awe and gratitude. We told them what we had experienced and assured them that the spirits of the children had found peace. The news spread quickly, and the orphanage that was once a feared and avoided place began to be seen in a new light. Plans were made to restore the building and turn it into a memorial for the children who had suffered there, a reminder of their history and a warning about the horrors of the past. My life changed drastically after that night. The nightmares and the feeling of being watched were gone, replaced by an inner calm. I knew I had done something significant, and although the memory of the orphanage would always be with me, I carried it with a sense of peace and purpose. The researchers were also scarred by the experience, dedicating their efforts to helping in the restoration of the building and the creation of the memorial. The orphanage of Hillcrest, once a symbol of suffering and despair, became a place of memory and hope. The laughter and cries of the children no longer echoed in the night, but their stories would live forever, remembered and honored by those who dared to listen. I clearly remember the day I arrived at the orphanage. It was an old and gloomy building with walls that seemed to murmur ancient secrets. The other newcomers and I were greeted by the director, a tall woman with a look that always seemed disturbing to me. I never knew why, but from the first moment, something in her presence caused me an indescribable uneasiness. The routine at the orphanage was strict. We woke up early, made our beds, and had breakfast in silence under the watchful eye of the caretakers. After classes, we had a couple of hours to play in the yard, although I could never shake the feeling that we were being watched, even when we were outdoors. One afternoon, while playing ball with my classmates, I noticed a half-open door in one of the hallways in the west wing of the building. That part of the orphanage was always closed, and we were forbidden to enter. Curiosity got the better of me, and making sure that no one was watching, I stealthily approached the door. The hallway was dark and dusty, with old paintings hanging on the walls. I walked slowly, trying not to make noise. At the end of the hallway, there was a small room. The door was half open, and a dim light filtered through the crack. I approached and carefully peeked in. I saw something that left me frozen. The room was full of photographs of children, some of them with faces I recognized. Children who had disappeared from the orphanage in recent years. Before I could react, I heard footsteps approaching. I hid behind an old closet, trying to hold my breath. The director entered the room, muttering something in a language I did not recognize. She held a lit candle and an old book. I watched in horror as she began to perform a ritual, drawing symbols on the floor with what appeared to be blood. I understood then that the missing children had been sacrificed as part of these dark rituals. I managed to escape the room unseen and return to my dormitory, my heart beating wildly in my chest. I wanted to tell someone what I had seen, but I did not know who to trust. The caretakers seemed to be under the control of the director, and my classmates were too young to understand the gravity of the situation. During the following weeks, I tried to stay away from the director and avoid any behavior that could attract her attention. However, my curiosity and fear drove me to continue investigating. I began to notice patterns in the disappearances. They always occurred around certain dates, coinciding with specific lunar cycles. One night, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back while more children were in danger. I waited for everyone to fall asleep and, armed with a flashlight, returned to the West Wing hallway. This time, my goal was to find enough evidence to be able to report the director. I checked every corner of the photograph room, looking for a diary or document that explained the rituals. I found an ancient book hidden in a secret compartment under the floor. Its pages were full of symbols and texts in an arcane language. Although I couldn't understand much, there were drawings and descriptions that clearly showed human sacrifices. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned quickly and saw one of my dorm mates. He was pale and his eyes showed absolute terror. He whispered to me that the director was looking for something and that we should leave before she found us. With my heart in my throat, I closed the compartment and we hid. The next day, the atmosphere at the orphanage was more tense than ever. The director seemed more restless and watchful, as if she knew someone had been snooping on her secrets. I decided it was time to act. There was a priest who used to visit the orphanage to offer mass once a month. Although I didn't fully trust adults, I felt that he could be our only hope. I waited for his visit to arrive and, Taking advantage of a moment when I was alone in the chapel, I approached him and told him everything. At first, he seemed skeptical, but the desperation in my voice and the fear in my eyes convinced him that something terrible was happening. He promised to investigate and asked me to keep quiet until he could gather evidence. The following weeks were a hell of uncertainty and fear. I knew that the director was getting closer and closer to discovering that I knew her secret. Finally, one night, the inevitable happened. The director called me to her office. I felt a shiver run through my body when I entered. Her smile was cold, and her eyes looked at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "You know too much," she said in a soft but threatening tone. Before I could react, two of the caretakers grabbed me and took me to the basement, where I saw the preparations for another ritual. The director began to recite words in that strange language, and I realized that I was destined to be their next sacrifice. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst, when suddenly the basement door burst open. It was the priest, accompanied by several policemen. They shouted orders, and the director was arrested. Although her look was still pure evil as she was taken away, the caretakers were also arrested, and the orphanage was temporarily closed while investigations were carried out. The following days were one of interrogations and paperwork. The children were relocated to other orphanages, and the building was closed. The priest promised me that those responsible would be brought to justice, and that the spirits of the sacrificed children would finally find peace. Despite everything, the experience left me marked forever. I will never forget the horror of those days and the dark practices of the director. Even now, years later, every time I see a picture of a missing child, I can't help but think of the orphanage and the dark secrets that hid within its walls. Working in an orphanage was never my dream, but over time it became my life. Here in this old red brick building with high ceilings, I have spent more years than I can count. I have seen many children pass by, some finding loving homes, others staying until life takes them to other destinations. This place has its own personality, a character formed by the laughter and tears of generations of children who have called this temporary shelter home. My daily routine consisted of preparing meals, organizing activities, and making sure everyone was safe and happy. However, lately something had been disturbing me. One of the children, a little boy with sad eyes and tangled hair, had begun to show signs of abuse. Every day he seemed to have new bruises on his body. At first, I thought they were the result of rough play or accidental falls, but it soon became clear that there was something more sinister at play. The child, who I'll call simply the little one, never talked much. He was quiet, observant, and always seemed to want to be in another world. The other children avoided him, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of the unknown. There was something about him that made them feel uncomfortable, and I, too, began to notice a restlessness every night when putting the children to bed. I made sure to check their beds and wish them good night, hoping that the darkness of the night would not bring with it more nightmares. One night, after turning off the lights and closing the bedroom doors, I stayed in the surveillance room checking the cameras installed for security. It was then that something caught my attention on the screen. I saw the little one writhing in his bed as if he were fighting something invisible. I stared, unable to look away. Suddenly, his body was lifted and thrown violently against the wall. A heartbreaking scream came from his mouth, but there was no one there to comfort him. I ran to his room, but when I arrived, the little one was in his bed, curled up and sobbing. There were no signs of the violence that I had witnessed on the screen, only the echo of his crying. I hugged him, trying to comfort him, but he just kept repeating over and over again, "She's coming for me. She's coming for me." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, watching the cameras, hoping to see something that could explain what had happened. But the hours passed, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. At dawn, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't allow that invisible presence to continue hurting the little one. Days went by, and every night the same scene repeated itself. The bruises on the little one's body increased, and my desperation grew. I decided to install additional cameras in his room, hoping to capture something clearer, something that could show me the truth behind those attacks. Finally, one night, I got what I was looking for in the recordings. I saw a dark figure, almost imperceptible, moving slowly towards the little one's bed. The figure leaned over him and began to press him, leaving marks on his skin. The little one woke up screaming, but the figure didn't stop. I saw how it hit him over and over again until he was unconscious. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How was it possible that something like this happened in a place where children were supposed to be safe? I decided I had to seek help. I had heard stories about exorcists and mediums, but I had never believed in such things. However, now I had no other choice. I found a local medium who agreed to come to the orphanage. When he arrived, his face darkened as he entered the little one's room. "There is a presence here," he said quietly, "a dark entity that doesn't want to leave." The medium performed a ritual, lighting candles and burning herbs while muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy and oppressive. I felt a piercing cold and a feeling of fear that I couldn't shake. Suddenly, the little one began to scream. His body arched and was lifted into the air by an invisible force. The entity didn't want to leave. The medium continued with his ritual. His voice rose as he commanded the entity to leave. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the little one was released and fell gently onto his bed. The room was silent, only broken by the child's sobs and my own ragged breathing. The medium explained to me that the entity was the spirit of a woman who had tragically died at the orphanage many years before. The spirit had been trapped here, full of anger and pain, and had found a way to manifest itself through the little one. He promised that the entity would not return, but the feeling of uneasiness did not disappear. Days passed, and although the little one no longer showed signs of abuse, the atmosphere in the orphanage was still tense. The other children also seemed to sense that something had changed. I decided to investigate more about the history of the orphanage, looking for any information that could shed light on recent events. I discovered that decades ago, a woman had worked as a caregiver at the orphanage. She had been a kind woman, loved by the children, but her life ended tragically when she was unjustly accused of mistreating the children. Desperate and with no one to defend her, she took her own life in one of the rooms of the orphanage. Since then, her spirit had remained trapped in the building, seeking revenge for the injustice she had suffered. I decided to visit the room where the tragedy had occurred. It was a small, dusty room full of old boxes and broken furniture. When entering, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I knew I wasn't alone. I began to speak, although I wasn't sure if anyone was listening. I explained to the entity that I knew her story, that I understood her pain, and that I wanted to help her find peace. Suddenly, one of the boxes fell to the floor, scattering its contents all over the room. Among the scattered objects, I found an old photograph of the woman, surrounded by smiling children. Upon seeing it, I felt a deep sadness and compassion for her. I promised that I would do everything possible to make her story known and that she would never be forgotten again. From that day on, I began to tell the story of the caretaker to everyone who came to the orphanage. I wanted everyone to know what had happened and for her memory to live in the hearts of those who cared for the children. Little by little, the atmosphere in the orphanage began to change. The air became lighter, and the feeling of fear faded away. The little boy also began to improve. His nightmares disappeared, and he began to interact more with the other children. His smile, although still shy, began to appear more frequently. I knew that the entity had found some peace, knowing that her story would be remembered and that her pain had not been in vain. Although the experience left me marked forever, I felt grateful to have been able to help free that poor, trapped soul. I learned that sometimes pain and injustice can transcend death, but also that compassion and understanding can bring comfort to even the most tormented spirits. The orphanage still stands, and every time I pass by the caretaker's old room, I leave a flower in her memory. It is my way of thanking her for having taught me that even in the darkest places, there is always a light that can guide the lost to peace. And although I will never forget the horrors that I witnessed, I know that in the end, kindness and love will always prevail. My arrival at the orphanage was the culmination of a series of misfortunes that marked my childhood. My parents died in a car accident when I was 6 years old, leaving me without family or home. The authorities transferred me to an orphanage located on the outskirts of the city, a place that at first seemed to me a safe refuge, but that would soon reveal its dark ones. The orphanage was an old building with stone walls and small windows that let in little light. The atmosphere was always gloomy, and the children seemed to carry an invisible burden on their shoulders. The caretakers were severe and strict, and the director, a woman with a cold and sinister look, imposed a regime of iron discipline. The orphanage garden was one of the few areas where we were allowed to be outdoors and enjoy the sunlight. However, there was something disturbing about the garden, a feeling of unease that we all felt but that no one dared to mention. The nights at the orphanage were particularly difficult. The silence was broken only by the whispering of the wind and sometimes by the moans that seemed to come from the garden. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but soon I realized that other children were also listening to us. We looked at each other in fear, but no one said anything. The caretakers had punished us for making up stories. One night, while we were working in the garden, one of the children, braver than the others, suggested that we investigate the origin of the wailing. At first, we resisted, but curiosity and fear drove us to follow him. We met secretly after dinner and headed to the garden with flashlights in hand. The garden was dark and silent, and the full moon cast eerie shadows over the rows of plants. We moved cautiously, whispering under our breaths so as not to attract the attention of the caretakers. The wailing was louder that night, a blood-curdling sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. We ended up with our bare hands moving the earth in desperation. It didn't take long to find something beneath the surface of the garden. We discovered small bones and fragments of clothing. Horror invaded us when we realized that we had unearthed the remains of children. The garden was planted on a cemetery of orphans who had been abused and murdered. Fear paralyzed us. We looked around, hoping that someone would discover us, but we were alone in the dark. We decided to cover the bones and return to our beds, but we knew that we could not ignore what we had found. The following nights were a torture. The cries continued, louder and more desperate. Some of us began to have nightmares, visions of pale and spectral children calling us from the orchard. We could not remain silent. We had to do something to stop it. We met again and decided to tell the director. We thought that although she was severe, she could help us get rid of the restless spirits. We were wrong. The director reacted with fury when we showed her what we had found. She punished us harshly and forbade us to talk about the subject. That night, the cries turned into desperate screams. We returned to the orchard, this time determined to go deeper and discover the whole truth. We found more bones and next to them, personal objects, broken toys, notebooks, and an old doll with its face destroyed. It was evident that the children had been buried with their few belongings. At the bottom of the hole we had dug, we found a wooden box. Inside it were old documents, letters, and photographs that told the story of the children buried in the orchard. They were orphans who had lived in the orphanage decades ago, when the headmistress was still young. We discovered that she had been in charge all this time and had carried out horrific acts of abuse and murder to maintain her power and authority. We realized that we were in danger. The headmistress would stop at nothing to protect her secret. We decided to run away from the orphanage and get help. We escaped into the night, running through the fields and woods until we reached the nearby town. There we found a priest and told him our story. At first, he didn't believe us, but our wounds and the fear in our eyes convinced him that something terrible was happening. The priest called the police, and together we returned to the orphanage. The authorities began to dig up the orchard and found the remains of dozens of children. The headmistress was arrested, and the orphanage closed. The spirits of the children eventually found peace, and we were moved to other safer places. Although we were safe, the scars of the orphanage remained with us. The nights still brought with them the echoes of the wailing and the images of the bones and broken toys. They never left our minds. We had survived, but the horror of the orphanage would haunt us forever.